The fact that something as badly managed as Christianity still existed 2,000 years after its founding, for G.K. Chesterton, was proof of a miracle of sorts. The fact that something as badly and terribly managed, under such poor stewardship and care, should continue to exist, such as the Catholic Church for Catholic G.K. Chesterton, would have been odd for him, would have been a proof of something, of perhaps a divine origin of an organization that has survived despite being very, very badly managed for a very, very long time. Now, that criticism by G.K. Chesterton might meet with shock and horror from some modern Catholics who seem to believe that criticizing the hierarchy of the church or the papacy is a sin which is just not to be done. Perhaps they can be forgiven by the fact that one saint who periodically criticized the Pope in letters privately written to him, but did not in fact say anything publicly, though the letters are widely known today. Perhaps whoever published them must have done some grave evil by doing so, because to her, criticizing the Pope in public was something evil to do, something very bad to do. This doesn't seem to be following in the biblical tradition, though, neither in the tradition of Jesus, nor in the tradition of the early Bible, nor in the tradition of not ceding to the heresy of the Donatists, who believed that the church had to be perfect, versus St. Augustine, who believed the church, including the hierarchy of the church, was a church filled with sinful people, ordinary sinful people who God nonetheless used for good in the end, as God has promised to turn all things to the good of those who love him. So how did Jesus deal with his superiors? And yes, Jesus had superiors, because Jesus in the Jewish religion was a layman. He was not a priest. He was not officially any kind of king. And in fact, we hear that the high priests took the crowd and had them call for his crucifixion, that the high priests, that the leaders of the priests called for Jesus to be dealt with badly, that they condemned him as a blasphemer for claiming that he was the Christ. So if his church of his day did that, well, how had he treated them beforehand, given this worse than excommunication that they had condemned him to death? Well, he called the priests, the Pharisees, when he had them mentioned in the Bible, would be people of note within the religious community. It would be the scholars, it would be the priests, it would be these notable people. So how did he treat them? He called them snakes. He called them graves. He said that they did more evil than good quite often, and called them hypocrites, as in grifters or actors. So these are not nice things that Jesus said to his superiors. John the Baptist was beheaded for his criticism of Herod, who was assigned king of the Jews by the Roman leaders of his time. Most of the prophets were persecuted, not because they lived quiet, good lives, but because they publicly and notably condemned their rulers for their inadequacy in their obedience to God and for their delinquency and evil. Many an early Christian saint, in fact, was killed or dealt with because they took on people who were powerful with worldly power and condemned their morals. So Christianity is full of saints who in fact stand up against those who are their superiors and speak up against them. You even have a certain figure within the church rebuking an emperor. So that's not the type of church which exists. Catholicism is a religion, not a cult. And if you look at the belief of papal infallibility, that's a very recent thing to be codified. For most of Catholic history, there was not really mention of that sort of thing. It was simply that you had the councils and you had things progressing. And yet, quite recently in Vatican I, you have the dogma of papal infallibility, and you have about three dogmas defined by that. But what exactly is it? Well, it's that the Pope can bind Catholic Christians to believe things which have always been believed and which are in line with the hermeneutic of continuity, which are in line of what's always been believed within the Church, and that he can demand that they believe things which have always been believed. But if he says something which is against anything in the past, then that's invalid. And a Pope here is a heretic. The validity of his papacy could be called into question in that case. So it's not this powerful ability which no one else has. It certainly is something which exists within the dogma of the Catholic Church, but it's not this all-encompassing voice of God that you might expect. Likewise, this idea you have that the Holy Spirit picks every pope personally, rather than God allowing the cardinals of the Church to pick the pope, and they have picked some rather terrible popes. They have picked many a King Saul, whereas God might have picked a King David. The King David himself, the Bible is quite critical of in the way it shows his behavior, and King Saul, it's quite critical of in the way that it shows his behavior. Even Abraham, the Bible is rather critical of. So, why would Augustine believe that priesthood and a hierarchy existed, but that hierarchy was not determined by who was the holiest, but merely by the passing of the blessing of the priesthood? That would probably come from the way in which God has shown the way that he blesses. For instance, going right back to Noah, you have Noah blessing his children, and then when Noah gets drunk, his one son decides to uncover his nakedness. Now, that's an odd phrase. Did he just see him naked? Or did he, as might be the case if you look later on in the Bible where that phrase is used again, might he have slept with his mother? Perhaps not with her consent to it. When this happens, Noah curses not his child because he's already blessed him and so he can't take back the blessing, but the child of seemingly that union. The reason for that union seems to have been that that child had wanted to have his line inherit rather than have the line of Shem, the firstborn, whose name means name, quite literally inherit. And one of the line of Canaan is mentioned later, Nimrod, who builds the Tower of Babel, along with others. And Nimrod and his companions do so to make a name for themselves in order to try and steal the blessing that Shem has. Though another sense in which it would be wrong what they did was that God in fact said to be fruitful and multiply and spread over the whole earth, while he was trying to gather everyone into one city. And so God scattered them. You get a little bit further and you have God's blessing to Abraham. Now, Abraham did a lot of bad things. He sent his son Ishmael along with the slave who he'd married and had her by, the handmaiden of Sarah, who'd been handed over to him because they hadn't been able to have a child. He sent both of them into the desert with not enough water to really survive. And then God decides that he's going to, after that, and after Abraham's disobedience, you have things such as the circumcision, well, after the disobedience of not having a child with Sarah and rather trying to have it with his wife's handmaiden, the circumcision is introduced. But before that, it was simply a covenant without that. But after he sends this poor child into the desert at maybe 17 years old with his mother, and they are about to die when God rescues them, after that, God commands him to take his child and to take that only begotten son, that only son, not begotten, sorry, and offer him as a burnt offering, the offering for propitiation for sin within the law that the Jews later adopted. It would be a burnt offering. And we're told in the book of Hebrews later in the New Testament that the reason why Abraham finally obeyed this after disobeying God again and again is that he believed that God could raise the dead. And so he thought that even if he sacrificed his son, that this would nonetheless result in the prophecy being God's covenant being fulfilled, that that child would give birth to children and continue on his family line. But that blessing is passed on to the child, and the child passes it on further. Now you have Jacob and Esau, Jacob who became known as Israel later, the two brothers. And Jacob firstly buys from Esau his right as the firstborn, and then he steals his blessing by tricking his father, Isaac, into giving it to him by pretending he's his brother. But when Esau comes to take the blessing, he can't take it. He can only take the blessing which remained, which was the blessing for Jacob. So that's passed on, even though it's by deception, to someone who was lying and being dishonorable. Of course, later on, you see that Jacob, now Israel, goes and he gives his brother material wealth and calls it a blessing in a way of trying to return a degree of that material wealth from the blessing, but the priesthood is passed on to Jacob nonetheless. And when Jacob has his 12 children and he's giving the blessing, he also gives it in a very specific way. He gives it to Judah, who gains the kingship. What you're looking at within the Old Testament is the passing on of a sort of charism, a sort of gift, which places someone in a relationship with God. And in the New Testament, you have the apostles. And when one of the 12 dies after betraying Jesus, they appoint another one, and they continue this process of handing down. Now, you might hear from the people who say not to criticize the Pope that St. Paul just quietly rebuked St. Peter, but Paul mentions it quite publicly what he did with St. Peter. And he also did so in a manner which was not entirely private. He was scandalized by what St. Peter did, and the biblical narrative also records what St. Peter did, and that was wrong. So the fact that we even know that St. Peter gave into the heresy of the circumcision, that he insisted on only really interacting with the Jews and adhering to the laws of the Old Testament until he was rebuked, despite being Pope, is quite something. The fact that we know that Peter denied Jesus Christ 3 times after Jesus had said, "You are Peter, rock, and on this rock I build my church," that he denied Jesus 3 times. So you have a pope, the first pope ever, and he is this imperfect figure. He falls for a heresy. He engages in a behavior which places an old law in front of the law of Jesus Christ. So you not only have him doing something wrong, you have him being criticized for doing that wrong thing. There's nothing wrong with that sort of valid criticism of people in authority doing evil. And if we are to say that for someone to have a position of authority they must be holy, then we fall into the Donatist trap. And the Donatists had good reason to feel the way they did, because Diocletian had abused the church and persecuted it, and some people had betrayed the church. And yet, after Diocletian was no longer in power, these bishops resumed their roles. And so the Donatists said, no, this can't be right. These are evil people. But St. Augustine and the Catholic Church says no. They say, yes, these people are evil. They've done evil, they've done wrong. But they are still in their positions of authority within the church. They still have been given that blessing by God. So, within Christianity, you need to be aware of something there. You need to be aware that Jesus was dealing with people who, until such time as he had died, were technically in authority over him. And the apostles were dealing with people technically in authority over them. And yet Jesus reacted to them in such a way that is very different. He chased the money changers out of the temple. He called the authorities of religion in his day evil. And the Bible directly says that the one high priest, had said that it is better that one die for the sake of many in relation to Jesus. And of course, it was the top priests within the Jewish religion who were persecuting Jesus and calling for his crucifixion. It was the hierarchy of the church. If Jesus' crucifixion would have happened today, it would have been the Pope and the cardinals doing it. These were figures of great authority who the Bible condemned. And the Bible isn't just some sort of book which isn't written. It's a book written by human beings of their experiences with God helping to guide their hands in writing so that they don't mislead as to who God is or the means of gaining salvation. So the Bible is written by human beings, and these human beings make very clear judgments of other human beings, including those in authority above them, and the saints periodically make condemnations of people above them. You might have some of the greatest reformers within the church, St. Francis of Assisi and the like, and if you look at their lives and how they act, they don't treat those in authority above them as gods. They treat them as human beings who are fallible and sinful, and they see it as their job to try and preach the choir and convert the church towards what's right and better. The idea that we have to have this perfect pope who never does or says anything wrong is not really one which is historical within the Catholic Church. Yes, within certain very specific instances of papal infallibility, the Pope has the authority to command Catholics to believe something. And that authority is very similar to the authority of each of the ecumenical councils, where they said that people who didn't believe certain things or who disbelieved certain things were anathema, who were excommunicated from the church. That's an authority, it exists. But if the Pope is wrong about something, that doesn't mean that you simply adhere to what the Pope says. If the Church is wrong about something, it doesn't mean that you simply adhere to what the Church says. The Church is a human body which is entrusted with obeying God, and which God has given just enough energy in it that the gates of hell will not overcome it. But that doesn't mean that those within the Church don't have a duty towards living in the daylight and towards living just and godly lives, and to rebuking others if need be, or showing why they are wrong and arguing against it. For instance, the modern church would say that the death penalty is very evil and can't be countenanced. And yet God in the Old Testament commanded people to stone others to death. He commanded the Israelites to wipe people out, as they did in the book of Judges, because those people were evil. If God is commanding people within a secular law of Israel to kill other people, then you can't possibly say that the death penalty is of itself utterly evil, because then you're condemning God. And Jesus, when the thief next to him on the cross was repentant and acknowledged that that thief was worthy of his punishment, but that Jesus wasn't, Jesus promised that thief that because of his repentance, he would see him in paradise. So by admitting that he deserved death, that thief actually gained life from Jesus. That's Jesus directly promoting something. And yet much of the modern church will try and get rid of the death penalty wherever possible, despite the fact that within the Old Testament, for instance, God sent plagues. And specifically, he sent a plague against the Israelites when they had gone, I believe it would be the city of Jericho. They'd gone in there and one man had stolen things he shouldn't have, that should have been given away to God. And God brought a plague. I believe, in fact, he allowed the Israelites to be defeated in battle in that case, until they discovered who it was, who had stolen, and they put him to death, because God had harmed them until that happened. And earlier on, you have an incident when Moses was in charge of the Israelites, where a plague had been brought upon them, and where an Israelite had seen a foreign woman go into the tent with a Israelite and had put them both to death for idolatry and for whatever else it would be. And when this happened, the plague stopped. So you have a God who seems to endorse a death penalty for sin, for evil. Yes, you might have Jesus saying that he comes to forgive sins, and we have mortal sins being able to be forgiven, deadly sins which God would have promoted the death penalty for in the Old Testament, being something which can be forgiven, and which are forgiven in Jesus through baptism, through confession, and so forth. But what you don't have is an authority within the Catholic Church to actually contradict the gospel and Jesus Christ and God. And where figures in the church want to promote certain ideas which are not, in fact, to do with the Bible or of the Bible or of the authority given to them, but an attempt to go against what God has commanded within His Word and within history and within the history of the church. These figures are not, in fact, figures who in these areas have to be obeyed or listened to, because they are going outside of their powers and outside of their authority, and they should be condemned for that. They should be negotiated out of that. They should be convinced out of that. And that's the proper approach within Christianity, to, in fact, look at what's happening, to obey where you're supposed to obey, but to see that the church is merely stewards appointed by God to take care of His people. They are not God Himself.